I would appreciate it if you didn't take any photos so that my supervisor doesn't know I'm here chairing this, so that he really does think I'm deep in the library. It's live. It's live. It's live. He's busy doing actual research, probably. So as you can see, I'm wearing orange. We've got our main keynote speaker wearing orange. We're in the orange stage. So if you ever get lost, just follow the people dressed as orange cones. Welcome, obviously, to this morning that's been kind of everything above the shoulders. We've had minds this morning, and now we've got brains. I'm a dementia researcher, and I definitely thought that I couldn't think of anything worse than doing anything below the shoulders. And certainly if you do dementia, you spend a lot of your time doing cardiovascular disease. So unfortunately, having been very dedicated to brains, I spend most of my time looking at hearts. I am a PhD student at the Alan Turing Institute, and I'm also the co-founder of an organisation called HealthTech that looks to get more women in health innovation. And we'd like to just get a bit of a gauge in terms of who the audience is here, because we had a mental health session before, and this session is probably going to go a bit more towards neuroscience, neurology. But just like we had to get an audience gauge of who knew what MDMA was, who knows what NMDA is? Right, and who can point to your occipital lobe? Who can point to that? Good. Some people it's not a prostate exam. It's just here, guys. Okay, fab. So we haven't got a highly neuroscientific audience, but that's very useful, I think, for our panelists to know. Fab. So I have huge pleasure in introducing our keynote speaker. As usual, for most of these CogX sessions, we've got about 20 minutes from a keynote, followed by about 35 to 40 minutes of panel discussion. And we won't be taking questions from the audience, but if you do have any burning questions, I'll keep my Twitter open at maxi_mackie. So if you do have any questions, please just tweet directly at me in the next 20 minutes, and I'll make sure that we can kind of weave it seamlessly into the panel discussion. So can we have a huge round of applause for our keynote, Mary Lou Jepsen from Openwater.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I am going to talk about something I thought was super impossible. I left my job 3 years ago. I was working in consumer electronics. I was running advanced consumer electronics at, I don't know if you can hear me, this might be better, at Facebook. And something was happening in consumer electronics. Manufacturing process improvements were being put in place for next generation virtual reality and augmented reality. And really augmented reality. And the thing that's made money in augmented reality that has every brain cell in consumer electronics working on it is really Pokemon Go. No joke. So I realized this thing was happening to enable next generation Pokemon Go, and no one saw it. And I thought we could use it to see in high resolution inside of our bodies and brains. And so I quit my cushy job at Facebook and started Openwater, which Peter named, is in the back there. And really, the idea of this is to put medical imaging into a portable at 1,000 times lower cost. And medical imaging that can see inside of our bodies and our brains. And this is the brain session, so we're going to mostly talk about the brains. But really, it's been interesting. I was in the ER, the emergency room last weekend in San Francisco. And at University of California, San Francisco, one of the top medical schools on the planet, there was only one MRI machine working. And there was only one ultrasound unit working, and the ER doctors couldn't diagnose anything. So, it's very important for brain and body. So, actually see my slides. So not to get too personal here, but I was denied an MRI scan for about a decade. I didn't know that I needed it, and 24 and a half years ago, my life was saved because somebody sprung for the cost of an MRI. They found my brain tumor, and that was great news because I had actually dropped out of my PhD in physics to go home and die because no one could figure out what was wrong with me. I was living in a wheelchair, body full of sores. I couldn't move half of my face. I was drooling. And that wasn't even the worst part. I could no longer subtract. And so I didn't think I deserved a PhD in physics. And so that was it for me. And I dropped out and asked my parents if I could move in with them. And then one of the med school professors sprung for the cost of the MRI. And they found that tumor. It took 1 month to get the surgery and then get better and petition to get back into grad school. And I'll admit it, I had the brain tumor excuse, and that worked. They let me in. I finished my PhD 6 months later. I got $4 million with 2 other students to start my first company. And I've been off and running ever since. And because I told you I had a brain tumor, like there's a stigma. Like we all have brain issues. Mine was solvable. It was benign. But, like I've done all these things since then. Like I've founded 4 startup companies. I was an executive at Google, at Facebook, at Intel. I was a professor at MIT. Like I'm still smart. It's fine. We are all still smart when we have mental disease. What was the last speaker? He's like, we have mental health. It's good. It means we're alive. So just with that as context, this could do enormous good. In being able to see in surgeries if when you're doing an operation, if you got it all out. Right now, there's a few surgical suites in the world where you can do the surgery, roll the patient into the MR scanner, roll it back out, check to see, back in, out, did I get it? That's like really expensive. Most people can't afford it. One of the problems with healthcare in the country I'm from is $1 in $5 in the United States is spent on healthcare. We can't just keep having it go up. Like, okay, billionaires, great. They get to, we were talking about that yesterday. They want to never die, right? And so there's all this funding on that, but it's almost like back to Greek gods or something. Like there's the mortals and the immortals, or what are we trying to make here? Actually people are dying right now, so let's fix that. One of the big impacts to mental health can be the debilitating results of a stroke that's not treated in time. And today that means access to an MR or CT scanner within 2 hours of having a stroke, faster if possible. So if you live in London, you're probably good because you'll have access to the scanner as long as it's working. If you live in the remote or rural area, you're not good because there's basically 2 different types of strokes. There's the clot type stroke and there's the hemorrhage type stroke. So the hemorrhage type, there's a drug you can take. With a hemorrhage type stroke, you can take a drug that clots it. With a clot type stroke, you can take a drug that bursts it. But if you get the drug wrong, the patient dies. And so if you can just find out what kind of stroke it was, you can, that victim of a stroke can walk and talk for the rest of their lives. If you don't, you can't. And so today that means whoever lives in cities, and cities that have great hospitals like London, and everybody else, tough luck. So if we can put this technology that we're shrinking and enabling us to leapfrog MRI into ambulances, clinics, and doctors, we can fix that problem and many others. And ER and monitoring. I promise you I'm going to get to the brain deck. Healthcare at home, right? So why not have this at home? Why not be able to, if you've got, like the BRCA gene, why not be able to see if something's growing or any kind of gene? Or if your parents got a cancer before the age of 50, you don't even need the genetic test. You're up. And then you have a risk condition for it. And if you could scan yourself and catch it early, that's the issue with many of these things, is catching it early. But so there's this biological basis of brain disease that we don't talk about. This is from a study last summer that took the only fMRI scans they had of clinically depressed patients. As someone in the audience just said in the last session, apparently 20% of you are on SSRIs. So like your chance of depression in a lifetime is more than 20%. If you're in a war zone, it's more like 50%. But here's the thing, is right now the way we diagnose these conditions is with a series of questions. Are you sleeping all the time? Have you been eating a lot? Do you have thoughts of suicide? And if you answer yes to that and a litany of other questions, you're clinically depressed. And the way we find out if you're no longer clinically depressed is when you start answering no to those questions. It's very subjective. And so in this study, they showed signatures for different types of clinical depression. from anhedonia, that's like the absence of hedonism, like no joy, to anxiety, to different types. And so if we could scan patients to more routinely inside of their brains to see how their therapy was going, be it dancing or talk therapy or a drug or whatever the therapy is, we could see what was having a positive impact and what was having a negative impact in a precision way. And this is true for a whole bunch of diseases. It's not done right now for one reason. It's too expensive. And so we have to lower the cost of it. I'm going to talk about lowering the cost. Right. So for all diseases, for all brain diseases, we could do this. If we could look inside of what's happening in the brain. It's hard to look inside and understand what's happening in the brain. MRI, fMRI, the video form of MRI, what it actually does is really just look at oxygen use, millimeter by millimeter in your brain. And from just looking, the part that's using oxygen, that's the active part. The part that isn't is the inactive part. And it looks at that by looking at how blood changes, because the blood carries oxygen and so forth. But just that little signal can give so much information. And what there are more, there's EEG, there's more things that we're doing at Openwater, but just oxygen is getting us pretty far. So what this can also enable is even just looking at oxygen use in your speech center can enable you to communicate speech with just thinking about it. Like, this is real. This is right now. This is using MRI scanners, and largely a lot of graduate students acting as the lab rats, laying in these MRI scanners for hundreds of hours, so maps of their brain can be made thinking of different words and so forth, and then pulling together that library to allow you to talk without talking. And there's more. This is work I saw about a decade ago. So this is old and grainy. This work really blew me away. This is by Professor Jack Gallant at University of California, Berkeley. And he used graduate students as well, threw them in MRI scanners for hundreds of hours and made them watch YouTube videos and recorded their brains reacting to YouTube videos, seeing where oxygen was being used millimeter by millimeter. Then showed a new clip and used the computer using that data of the machine store of the library of the hundreds of hours of YouTube videos, or of the reactions to the YouTube videos, inferred what it thought the students were looking at. And the result is grainy, it's low resolution, but I saw this and I'm like, wow, we just have to up the resolution and lower the size of that MRI scanner. And that's amazing, because if you combine that with the fact that if you imagine an image versus seeing an image, the same areas light up in your brains. This has been shown for music, for whether you're in love or not, for dreams. A Japanese group just did this with graduate students. I mean, this is painful. Lay in the noisy MRI scanner and fall asleep, and then get waken up 90 seconds after and report what you were dreaming about. Repeat, repeat, repeat. They got their PhDs, but it's amazing. So you could dump your dreams to video. I mean, it's amazing. So there are profound legal and ethical and moral issues with this. Can the police make you, if we can put this thing into a ski hat, can the police make you wear it? Can your spouse make you wear it? Can you put it on your 13-year-old kid when they come home at 2 in the morning and you want to know where they were? I think the answer to that is no. Our systems will only work consensually. But here's the thing, is that when you think about, we could decide not to understand our brains. We could just decide as humanity, we don't want to know. There's 2 billion people on the planet with brain disease, but boy, it's too scary because our thoughts might get out of there. It's this last bastion of privacy. And yet, do the goods outweigh the bads here? I mean, what could happen if we could understand each other better? If you could understand ourselves and start to control our behaviors better by looking more deeply inside of our brain? It won't be the AIs getting us, we'll become better, right? We'll harness the AIs and the creativity that we have and the curiosity in an interesting way. But it's a discussion that has to happen. Here's the thing is we're developing this to try to transform medical imaging, but a side effect is it's going to enable us to communicate almost telepathically. And that should be great for understanding and also scary. A friend of mine, Jason Ponton, talks a lot about how, for him, he thinks it means, if this happens, the end of love. Because he thinks to fall in love with somebody, to fall in love, the falling in love part, there has to be this mystery. And if it's an open book, and I'm just like, well, you can just put filters on while you're falling in love. But then, it's funny, I was talking to this reporter at Fox News. I'm American. Like, I don't know anybody. I don't know. I decided to try to talk to more people. And he's like, no, it's not the end of love. It's the end of war. Because we'll start to understand each other about more. And this is a Fox News guy. And I'm like, okay, cool. Great. Let's focus on that. What's going to happen is I think we all have to talk about what kind of rules we want to put on this technology as we're developing it. And it's an interesting moment to talk about it as we're having that discussion around social media. There's been a lot of learning from that, and what do we want to put in place for this next generation of technology. So it also can enable us to open the blood-brain barrier, deliver microdosing of drugs, ablate tissue, surgery without the knife, many, many things. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this works, and then, because what I've just said says, what if you could have this very small cell phone size or ski hat size scanner with better resolution than MRI? A lot of things, and that's in fact what we've done. And by the way, again, just to explain, 2/3, 3/4 really of humanity lacks access to medical imaging, and the prices have not changed since it saved my life in 1995. Guess what? The manufacturing process improvements of tooling 2-ton magnets with super cool liquid helium, superconductors. You just don't get that price down curve that you do with consumer electronics. And so I feel we have to do something. And the solution to this is to really rethink it. Our bodies are translucent to red and near infrared light. You know that if you've ever gone outside on a dark night, cupped your hand around a flashlight and saw the light go through. The problem is, so translucent to red light, but also, so the other things that are the other kinds of rays that our bodies are translucent to are gamma rays, X-rays, and magnetic fields. Guess which one's cheaper? Like, by a lot. And so if you could use red light, that would be great. A lot of people have tried for like a century. The problem is your body scatters that light. And here's the trick. Everybody thinks scattering is random. It's not. I did finish that PhD in physics, remember? It's deterministic and reversible if you can record the waves in the wavelength of light. And that's possible now because every single one of you in this room that has a smartphone has a camera in it that has pixels that are the size of the wavelength of light, which means we can beat light against each other and record information from the waves. It's called holography or interference patterns or so forth. But we use that, and another trick, we focus ultrasound down. And when we focus that ultrasound ping down, the light that goes through that's scattering through your body, the light that goes through that focus ping changes color ever so slightly. Just like the pitch of a police car siren changes as it speeds past you. It's called Doppler shift. And so we send the light in where it focuses, the light changes color, and we pick up the change of color by beating that with another beam that we changed color, and we can extract information spot by spot as we scan out your body. And so we've made new kinds of lasers, new kinds of camera chips, and new kinds of ultrasonic chips in the $1 trillion manufacturing supply chain of Asia, and it works. You might say, well, what about skull and bones? No problem. Skull is white. The light goes right through. Really, it goes right through. It's amazing. It doesn't go through blood as much. Blood absorbs, and so we can see blood, which is really handy because tumors have 5 times the amount of blood as normal tissue. But we're good on fundamental optics, like white reflects light, black absorbs light. That's optic. And so here's a little video of it. If ultrasonic ping goes down, we bring in the light, it changes color, and we bring in another beam of light. We look at those interference, we call them fringes, and we decode them a lot like Rosalind Franklin decoded this iconic image of X-ray diffraction to reveal the structure of DNA for the first time. But we can do that a million times a second now. So here's where we are. We started with this big lab rig last year, raised some money to fab the chips that we needed, and we're now in sort of a small Coke can size probe, and we'll shrink it in a few years. We think we can put this even in a tricorder like thing, certainly in ambulances. And yeah, here's some of the scans. This is a phantom tissue where we use optically mimicking tissue that also ultrasonically mimicking, and we compare ourselves to MRI. This is with toothpicks, cross toothpicks, and so you can see it's a different image quality where you can see compared to the MRI. And then this just from the weekend. This is a kidney where we have slices of the kidney. We didn't slice the kidney. We imaged through with by focusing the ultrasound, and that compares to standard ultrasound or MRI, and you can see we have arguably better than MRI using camera chips developed for Pokemon Go and lasers and focused ultrasound. So that's pretty cool. We're in small animals right now and human trials next year. Right. You might be worried about false positives and implications, and it's like, look, all of those rules were made when MRI scans cost $1,000, $10,000. You can only do them every 6 months. On a CT scan or a PET scan, you can only have a certain number of them in your life, or your chance for cancer goes up. You become like, it's radiation you're exposed to, and you're apparently between 3 and 12% of the cancers in the United States are already caused by medical imaging systems. So when you don't have any radiation, you can do it more often, and you care about the answers to 3 questions. Is it getting bigger? Is it getting smaller? Is it staying the same size? A lot like how you use the thermometer or the blood pressure cuff. That's what we want to move this to. So where we are is we have alpha kits end of this year and small animals, human trials next year, and then shipping thereafter that. So yeah, medical imaging at 1,000 times lower cost that has profound implications for the body and the brain. And love to talk to you about it, and thank you. I just found the confidence monitor. Sorry, I couldn't see the slides.
A huge thank you to Marilyn. I'd love to bring the other speakers up to the stage. I'm aware that lots of people are standing and it's quite hot. So can everyone stand up and then kind of shimmy towards the middle so that people who are standing on the edges can have a seat? And also, you get some blood flowing and you get some fanning. There's always some fanning happening at the back. So just shimmy along across. Perfect. You go see that. Gentlemen, there's a gap there. There's a gap there. People just hogging gaps. Or if you're happy standing, then more power to you. Okay, fab. So thank you so much. Do you want to scooch up one so that we're all together? Fab. So a huge thank you to Mary Lou. I'd love to introduce our other 2 panelists. So we have Arysha Vahabzadeh, who is the Chief Medical Officer of Brain Power. And then we also have Aldo Faisal, who is the Director of the UKRI Centre for AI for Healthcare at Imperial College London. So a huge thank you and a round of applause to our new panelists who have just joined us. So obviously we have had quite a thorough background to Mary Lou and where she's come from and what she's working on. But it'd be great to have a couple of minutes intro from both of you just to introduce yourselves to the audience. Do you want to start?
Sure. So I'm a professor, and so in our research we work on integrating artificial intelligence for healthcare solution. In my own research, we mainly focus on neurotechnology, so combining technology with neurosciences, similar to the Openwater applications you've seen, but we're also interested in AI-guided interventions, where we look at ways of treating and planning treatments for people who have mental health or neurological disorders.
Okay, so I guess I'll start with the academic thing first. I'm a former member of Harvard faculty at the School of Medicine. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at BrainPower. We build augmented reality and AI solutions for children with autism and ADHD, software on smart glasses to help them develop social and emotional skills, technology that's validated by research. My own background is I'm a psychiatrist, child psychiatrist, correctional psychiatrist by clinical training.
Perfect. So I usually start most of my panels also with a fun fact. You might think it's cringe, but I personally really like it because you hear weird and wonderful things about people's backgrounds. So do each of you have a fun fact? If you didn't read the briefing, this is going to be a terrible surprise for you.
Somebody else go. Can someone else go first? I'll think of something. Well, is this one on?
So I want to go and visit Downing Street. I've been to the White House on quite a few occasions for social and professional work, but I've never had a chance
biggie.
to. But I'm jealous that a lot of my friends have got to go there. But probably now's not the right time, judging by all.
Yeah, it's vacant. They're looking for residents at the moment.
Right.
Okay, so my fun fact is I'm an empirical professor, meaning my first job was with McKinsey, and then I went into investment banking, and then I decided I want to do research. So that's the opposite direction my students are taking.
Gosh, how different. Go ahead, Mary.
I was an art major.
Gosh, art major to physics, that is a massive change. Perfect.
And electrical engineering, the art. Okay.
So I just wanted to start with a kind of quite open question around, obviously it's very obvious how lots of technology can be really helpful for neurological conditions, but at the moment, how do you feel technology is failing those who suffer from neurological conditions?
How is it not failing? There's nowhere to go but up, right? Is that fair?
Yeah, I think you're right. If we look at the technology that's in clinical practice, it's actually very, very limited. We don't have a lot of integration into clinical pathways, in the US anyway, in mental health or primary care settings. And there are a whole range of consumer apps out there, and the evidence behind them for many of them is actually very limited. So in some ways, the clinical setup hasn't really got a lot of technology at play in terms of mental health. And the consumer space, a lot of it isn't validated. So as you said, there's a long way to go.
Yeah. I think one way in which technology is failing consumers and patients is that we, as a community of people who develop technologies, are not good at communicating the difference between regulated, clinically tested, and trialed medical devices and toys, gadgets, an app that you download that gives you the impression it will detect skin cancer because it can take a picture of your skin and decide on that. And this is something where we as a community need to build your and the consumer's awareness that there's a big difference, just like vitamin supplements are not the same as an FDA-approved drug.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of termed this thing called neurotrash, which is basically where someone will make some kind of neuroscientific claim around, you wash your face, it triggers some pathway, and then you get cured of some condition. And you'll see these absolutely mind-blowing claims that get banded around, internet forums, Instagram, etc. So to what extent has the neurotrash infection kind of affected your work? How often do you find yourself kind of fighting that disinformation that I feel that neuroscience is particularly plagued with?
All the time, fighting it all the time, because we do a lot of this kind of social emotional training, helping kids make eye contact, recognize emotions, and then we've got this big box of brain training. So we've had some very large commercial groups kind of come along, label their technologies or their app as brain training, and get kind of skewered in the media and by scientists. So now people are sometimes wary of this, of just brain training as a term, but it really encompasses a lot of different things, and some of those can be much more validated than others.
Can I just continue on that? Because I think lots of people are a bit unsure about, is brain training effective? Does it work? In what ways does it work? And I think that would be a question that I think lots of people have is, what is brain training? Is it effective?
I think it varies. I think
I'm for whatever works, but yeah, I mean, education is another form of brain training, right? So sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. I mean, it's interesting. In a discussion with Jack yesterday, who's sitting over there, he was like, my neck is on the line if I make a mistake. And I hate to quote you, but I thought it was beautiful. Like, if you're worried about what's regulated and gone through FDA versus not, and defining that it works if it gets through FDA and it doesn't, that may not be true. We know FDA delays things, at least, and there's so many differences in people. And if it's actually the patient's neck that's on the line. And we know so little about what works and doesn't work. And this comes from a discussion Jack and I had with the right to try. And where do we say, doctor knows best versus right to try, and yet there are all these scams out there. And I think I think Pandora's box is open. Like, I think people are going to try to do whatever they can to stay alive. And 80% of the time, if you present with these 5 symptoms, it's this thing, and 20% of the time, it's one of, let it be 4 million. And how do we walk through to figure out what that is? And it's not it shouldn't be the doctor's neck on the line for not being able to figure that out. It's like the whole healthcare team, including the patient, has to work together to figure out what's working and what isn't. But if the way the laws are is that the doctor's penalized for that, that's going to break. That has to change.
I think a big thing is generalization. When we look at any of these kind of brain training technologies, you have to kind of ask yourself, what is the actual patient doing? So are they like filling out some kind of puzzle? And what is the outcome? Because some of these companies make claims that filling out puzzles or doing a certain activity is going to result in some kind of benefit. And that's really come under fire. So one of the important things is to look and see, do they have any evidence for this generalization? Filling out puzzles, is it actually going to result in delaying Alzheimer's or having some kind of enhancement in terms of your memory? So I think just considering that fact, that's something very important.
So I think one of the challenges that we always need to consider is, how do we know that something really works? Because very often just deploying a new technology changes something. It can be a placebo effect. But what we're seeing, if you look in the work done so far, is that there's very little randomized controlled trials, right? So if you have a new app that trains you to be happier in some way or and overcome your depression, are we really testing that app with the specific algorithms against another app that does something more generic to prove that this new app is really helping you improve, and not just the fact that you're using an app has this effect? And so these are basic things that evidence-based medicine has developed and driven in more the pharmaceutical domain, but we need to think about this also in the technological domain. And here comes, of course, the challenge. The more powerful these apps are, the more data we're collecting, and the more unique you become. So instead of talking about clinical trials of n equals 1,000 people, we're deploying something, effectively we're making now or thinking about micro-interventions that are tailored to you while you're sitting here in this moment to be optimal. How do we start evaluating these things? And so this is where sort of a next generation of medical statistics is being developed to try to be able to measure these impacts, and if they're really real or just look good.
I think that is a really good point, because there's I think having an analogy with the pharmaceutical industry, I think, is really interesting, especially when it comes to technology, because people seem to have kind of almost illogical concerns when you benchmark things about AI versus medicine, and people raise concerns that actually the pharmaceutical industry has been raising for decades and has got quite far in addressing. So one of the things that people are most sensitive around is technology, brain-computer interaction. So how, in what way is kind of BCI at all different to, say, taking anything like caffeine to psychedelics? Why is there this kind of seemingly arbitrary boundary between these two ways of enhancing or changing our brains?
Privacy. just one word, privacy. And then when you start to write it, free will, right? So that's different than taking caffeine.
Can you go a bit more into that? Because I know you mentioned in your talk, but I think you ran out of time, because I think there's some kind of really interesting themes within that.
When we can communicate, like right now, it's ridiculous. We have these talking sticks, right? Why don't we have this whiteboard where we can see, like someone over there in the audience has maybe a more interesting idea than us, not that, me, not all you, but me. So what if we could see that and we'd just stop, we'd like go over and start talking about that thing instead of that thing. Right now, like, we have really great inputs to our head, like our eyes and ears are pretty great, a lot of stuff's going on. But it comes out by moving our tongues and our lips, right, or typing, single track. You're all sitting there with really cool thoughts having to listen to me. That's crazy. What if we could communicate at the speed of thought? What would we be capable of then? Could be amazing.
A lot more than caffeine takes, that's for sure.
Well, I guess at the moment, in terms of BCI technologies, these are just readout devices. Taking caffeine would be the equivalent of writing into your brain, and people are thinking about how to do that. We can do that reasonably well in mice and in other animals, where we can clone genes into the body and the brain, where you can write with light into the activity of brains. How you do it in humans, people looking at ultrasound type of modifications. So things are coming. But the question is, do you want your brain activity to be actually modulated, right? And we may have a debate about that, similarly to, is it okay to take LSD, for example, right? And then there can be a lot of controversy about it at this level. So I think the question is, at the moment, we're still focusing on getting the reading to work, read the brain state, reconstruct the video properly that we saw earlier. But it's about writing that we need to think about if you really want to enable communication.
I think another point is, once we get to do some of the writing, is that we can be very specific in terms of a pathway or particular focus for a particular patient. At the moment, the clinical use of medications, when you take most of the psychotropics, it affects the entire brain, and you end up having a lot of side effects. And we know part of the addiction crisis that we have in the US is there's a lot of people that are trying to modulate their mood and things like anxiety, for example, using a lot of easily accessible chemicals like nicotine and alcohol, and even prescription medications like opioids.
I think that's an interesting point about the heterogeneity of neurological conditions. The moment we kind of blast specific pathways and just kind of hope that it gets the right thing at the right point. And increasingly we're starting to understand the heterogeneity of these neurological conditions, and depression is not just depression, dementia is not just one condition, and there's these are all syndromic. So how does that kind of affect when you're trying to kind of build technologies to allow us to explore that heterogeneity in neurological conditions?
Well, I mean, we use focused ultrasound, and if you combine that with a drug that can only be burst through focused ultrasound, you get the right density of the drug at the right spot. And yes, it's FDA approved for some conditions, and more of them. We're working actually with the Focused Ultrasound Foundation on this, which on their cover page for technology, they've got a fantastic bar chart of like about 100 indications and how far it is in which approval process, and a few of them have made it all the way through FDA and reimbursement. But you can track the development of that there. There's other approaches as well with I suppose you mentioned optogenetics, but that's not really approved for human use yet. But there's a lot that's been understood in rats and so forth. But a way to get around the the focusing of the speech center goes when I'm tired. I arrived yesterday morning. I apologize. But the way you don't bathe your whole system with a chemical and just get part of it is to make it so that you can only turn it on in a certain place. We can also do that with light. So we also are able to focus light deep into the brain. I showed live on stage at TED last year, focusing down to 3 microns, which is the diameter of the smallest neuron, which means we can read the state of a neuron non-invasively, or write the state of a neuron non-invasively. There's this other problem, though, no one actually understands how a neuron works. As Paul Allen, my dear friend, the co-founder of Microsoft, used to say, there's 5 Nobel Prizes just to understand how a neuron works. We've got 100 billion of them, each with 100 million connections and so forth. And so it's complicated to figure out how to write the state. But there's, even just what has been shown in rats and mice is. Did I just say race?
I love those experiments in rice.
Is that you can turn off the area that makes them. You can make obese mice and turn off optogenetically the area that makes them eat and get them. You can make alcoholic mice too. This has been shown. Just by turning off one little section, you can change behavior, and that's not the whole. That's not understanding all 100 billion neurons. You can have really amazing effects in mice for conditions we'd like to change in humans.
So I think one thing that struck me is when we're thinking about interfacing with the brain, we're thinking a lot about the cells and the cellular level. But there are sort of, macroscopic things at the cognitive level that we need to think about. So, a few years ago we started having fun with giving people a robotic third thumb and studying how does the human brain integrate a whole extra limb, not replacing a missing limb, having an extra limb. How do you write into the brain? How do you interface it so that they can use it? And it's not entirely clear, because basically all bits and pieces in the brain are spoken for, right? Each finger has a certain area recorded and reserved in the brain. So if you add a new part to the brain, you augment or extend the brain, is existing space being used up or not? And so we started a whole project of research around that. And the findings are interesting. And I'm not going to the details of that. But basically, we are very preoccupied at looking at the microscopic level of what's going on, but need to think about what's happening at the macroscopic level. So here's an interesting fact for 2 people who have a lot of experience with head-mounted displays, is if you study perception in people, you will find that, of course, to have 3D perception, it's where your 2 eyes point, so it's the vergence that determines how far something is away, and that's why VR headset gives you 2 different images for the left and the right eye. Now, the interesting thing is there's another component that makes up for depth perception, and that's the distance at which you focus your eyes. Now, in a head-mounted display, you focus your eyes straight ahead of your eyes, right there. But interestingly, if you look into various forms of psychiatric diseases, you find a dissociation between the accommodation of the eye and the vergence of the eye. Now, I'm not saying that using head-mounted display induces that, but it's interesting that you have a dissociation in some form of diseases that we need to think about when we're designing head-mounted displays. And what I'm trying to say is that this whole cognitive neuroscience comes around when we're thinking of putting devices into people. And the challenge is, and I'm not talking about these gentlemen and lady here, but I'm talking about, in general, the field is very much preoccupied with tech people delivering just pure tech. And it's really the integration with the neuroscience and with the clinical work that is fundamental.
I think that's a really great point. Just in some of our clinical work with children with autism, we've found that lighter head-mounted displays that don't cover large parts of the face have been much more effective. That are lighter, so they don't put a lot of pressure on the nose. And when we're trying to teach these children how to socially interact with some of these AR cues, we don't want half of the child's head covered. So when we use something like HoloLens or Magic Leap, you're really losing a lot of that area when they're trying to communicate to somebody else. So just the physical design, you can be a techie and be very excited about, this is the hardware is more powerful and there's more pixels and the battery life is better. But if it's fundamentally undermining some of that basic interaction that you're trying to achieve, it's something you have to bear in mind.
So
we have solved the vergence accommodation conflict in the 90s. We've made all kinds. I used to make head-mounted displays, big, little, small, Google Glass. Google Glass was really a system that we made in the 90s with microdisplays. So these things, just the fundamental. It's not tech for tech's thing. It's okay, do it without us. Like, go ahead. Like, imagine it. Like, you have to build something. And the realities of building means that you have to build it in factories that you either build or exist, and you have to figure out how to do something. So, anyway, divergence accommodation conflict is there are things in the lab that I'm NDA'd, I've signed too many things, that solve this. The problem with VR and AR is people aren't buying it, and the thought is that the only place it'll be useful is in that to start and ship a hardware product. Just to start, you better ship $100 million a year of product. And if you guys can consume that, great. And if not, can't make it for you. That's the problem. Yeah. It's not tech just liking tech. It's tech saying, look, if I'm going to ship something at a consumer price level, I have to fill that factory for $100 million a year.
There's a lot of various kind of new startups and specific neurotech accelerators launching, and we're really struggling to see their traction at scale in the market. So of those kind of smaller companies and innovators that have been successful, like what is it about them that means that they have become successful and they have gained that commercial traction? If any.
Incubators?
No, so neurotech startups or kind of small companies, or if there are any.
But if they're small, then like you're asking which ones have been small and become successful in neurotech. Well, SSR, Prozac and stuff like that.
What is it about them that it's not allowing them to get the scale? Because everyone's very excited about this field, and everyone's kind of starting these companies that are dying so quickly.
People aren't buying it, and it's not useful to them. Like, we're for what works. It's not working, right? Ultimately, it's not good enough.
Well, I think the world's largest neurotech company identified as such would be Medtronic, which has been a medical device manufacturer for many years, and they're growing steadily, but they're nowhere at the scale of Google, Facebook, or Apple. But I think the thing is that what we're seeing is the beauty of this technology that comes for consumers, and then you see that there may be a second application with the healthcare realm, and I think it's that repurposing that basically takes where we need to connect again with. Is that actually still medically meaningful? Is it meaningful for the patient? Or is it just the fascination of having a cool device that we hope will work? And there I think there needs to be more work done. I think on the consumer level, the consumer technology is fantastic. I just enjoy it. But once we repurpose it for medical purposes, I think we need to be a bit more aware of what the limitations may be.
But, food is medicine, right? Like, everything we do is medicine, and we're trying to say medical is this little separate. We have sick care, not health care, right? So we're talking about sick care, and if we change the discussion to be about health care, how does all of this fit into it?
But this brings us back to the nutritional supplements. Anyone can make up a nutritional supplement with some fancy things plucked in the Himalayas and then attribute all sort of health benefits to it and sell it. But it's just, a nutritional supplement. It's unregulated.
You have to eat every day. I'm talking about literally food. Mm-hmm. Like, what did you have for breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks,
Sure.
The whole thing. There's some regulation on the health and safety for those, but you can make the choices like, the French fries or the salad, like literally, like you can make these choices, and we know information. We know what.
Before we get sidetracked down a food supplement, Gary, one of the things is that often, and I know that you've done a lot of work on this, Arysha, but a lot of it is how do we change our brains so that we fit better into society. And I think autism is a really good example of that. And actually, there's some question to be like, well, actually, how can we in society have a little bit more empathy and understanding to help those people who are more neurodiverse? So how can we use technology so that it's not them changing their brains, but it's us?
So I'm going to say that our company actually hires and interns autistic people within it. So several of our graphic design leads, etc., self-identify as having autism. Technology, if you develop technology in isolation, or you just get a group of people who are very homogeneous and develop technology, you can really miss out on a lot of important things like user interface, and there could be a lot of biases that could be developed in a technology. So for us, it's actually been very helpful to have perspectives of people, say, with ADHD, or who say they're autistic, or just even sociodemographically. If you have a technology that they have to use every single day, or they have to go to a clinic to use it, there's a lot of issues in terms of transportation and accessibility and things like that. So I think that having this diversity included in the data, so making sure that you're collecting user data from a diverse group, in the people who are creating a product to incorporate lots of different perspectives, and also in the end users to get feedback on what's working or what's not working for a specific group of individuals. For example, some children with autism really struggle with sensory issues around the face and eyes and nose. So certain devices wouldn't be a great fit for those children, while in some other children it's more of the social engagement that's an issue. So even that will have a big correlation to how you design a product, or whether you need to add a little piece of different piece of hardware, for example, to make it more comfortable.
I'm getting the signs that we have to wrap up, so I'm really sorry we're going to have to end the panel there, but we have a huge round of applause for our three amazing panelists.